To our Siemens colleagues for organizing this meeting. Really nice to hear all the fantastic developments that are going on at 7 Tesla. And thank you very much for inviting me to present our work on the 10.5 Tesla. This is a major effort. So many people are involved. They are listed over here, and I will mention their names as we go along as well. So, you have heard a lot about 7 Tesla, and 7 Tesla came into existence really because we were very much motivated after the introduction of functional imaging to be able to go to these mesoscopic scale computational units in the brain, exemplified by the orientation columns and the ocular dominance columns. And we knew that we actually published a paper at 4 Tesla on ocular dominance columns. We didn't have very good images, but we did actually showed time courses, and we were finally, after many years, were able to accomplish this at 7 Tesla. This is in 1999. 1995, we started discussing with David Rayner about developing 7 Tesla. This is in 1999, the first 7 Tesla magnet. Going into CMRR, and these data were then published in 2007 and 2008, so approximately slightly more than a decade of planning and work. Now, there are a lot of work right now going on at 7 Tesla, working at these scales, and I listed some of them without references. I apologize for that, but I don't really have time to mention them, but they are all looking at something like 0.5 millimeter microliter voxel volumes, something like 0.8 millimeter isotropic resolution, which is fantastic, but I have to admit, as someone who has worked at the scale, that this is still a challenge at 7 Tesla. It is not so easy. It doesn't just drop from the sky with easily. You have to work at it. And not only that, this voxel size is still somewhat large for brain imaging. And we really want to go to something like 0.1 microliter or better voxels, and hence the 10.5 Tesla project. So it started in 2008, and with planning, and the magnet was ordered in 2009. And you can see again, more than a decade of planning and work, and I've grown gray and looking like an old man with a beard, waiting for this to happen, but finally, we are there. In 2013, December, the magnet was shipped to a port, northern Minnesota, Duluth, and the magnet arrived before the port froze, actually, because this port freezes. And I think the magnet manufacturer timed it really beautifully, because then we got a pre-cooled magnet. And finally, after a lot of work of implementing electronics, ramping up, surviving a training quench and many regulatory steps, in December 2017, my colleagues finally obtained the first image. Greg Metzger, Pierre-François, Andrea Grant, and Pierre-François and Greg Metzger are here. So again, a lot of work. And these are, I want to mention that these data are obtained under FDA investigational device exemption. I mean, this is something, it's a new field. We had to do this for the 7 Tesla because when we started the 7 Tesla, that was the first time that was being done. And so we are experienced with this process. And so it is now under FDA device IDE. And the primary goal of this first set of studies is really to determine the effect of 10.5 Tesla exposure on human volunteers with respect to physiological parameters, vestibular system, and cognition. And there are, of course, imaging sessions scanned into this procedure, but they are really a secondary objective. So the images I'm going to show you are not really optimized, and there are very little time to obtain those images. And finally, I want to mention that FDA submission is based on multi-channel transmit. Everything is multi-channel transmit on this 10.5 Tesla, and FDA requires that they approve each RF coil, and we have to obtain a lot of safety data and submit it to them for each RF coil, which is very good from the safety point of view. Of course, slows us down quite a bit. So I'm going to show you some of the first images, and they are all, first images are all torso images. And you all know that, when you work, when the object size relative to the wavelength gets larger, like in the torso, so torso is a much more difficult target than the head. So, of course, why start with an easy target? And let's start with the more difficult one. And so they are all currently based on a 10-channel dipole coil like this. It's an array that goes into flexible pocket like this, and you can put this on the subject like this, and there's another part that is underneath the subject. And these are the very first 10.5 Tesla images, literally obtained in the pelvis area of a volunteer. And here are some high, blown up versions of the area of the prostate. Greg Metzger is very much interested in prostate imaging, so naturally he tends to gravitate towards prostate imaging. And here are some demonstration that you can get quantitative data. Apparently this is he tells me it's a clinical procedure, but now it's done at 10.5 Tesla in coronal and axial images, and some T1 maps, T2 maps, and even diffusion imaging with a B value of 2000. So some more images in the hip region showing you the joints. And what is really also remarkable in this case is that these are just B1 shim images, and they were based on this paper we published in 2012. So they are actually optimizing just over the hips, and they yield pretty nice image across the entire slice, and of course some non-uniformities in the middle there. So moving along, it's the coronal slice again in the pelvic area, showing in another subject the hips blown up over here. And there's a proton density and a medic scan. And apparently this is the labrum. I always ask my wife what that is, but I don't tend to forget about it, but apparently it's labeled in this slide so that I don't forget it. And some more images. And these are not single slice images, actually. These are volumetric images, and you can actually, in 3D, you can see many slices. This is the medic sequence in the 10.5 Tesla. Kidney images, this particular sequence is influence enhanced, so you can actually get angiography data from that, and you can see these vessels going through and the rest of the organ going through the sample like that. And liver, big target, difficult target, but still, you can, in this case, B1 shim, phase only, one spoke, and two spoke images, where you can actually continue to recover contrast on various areas of the liver, and these are the B1 field maps, and these are the images that you can obtain. Now, cardiac, this is the only single cardiac study so far at 10.5 Tesla, and Janet showed some efforts at 7 Tesla from us, but here it is 10.5 Tesla. Long time ago, I remember at 7 Tesla when we were working in the brain, and then we had ambitions about going to the abdomen, to the torso, and a lot of people were saying, well, that's that's impossible. But here we are now at 10.5 Tesla cardiac imaging, and again, one and only study, and not necessarily optimized at all. I want to make the point again that these are really not optimized studies in terms of RF coils, parameters, etc. And I showed you that this is the coil that we are using. But at 7 Tesla, we use even more advanced coils now. For example, 7 Tesla, we have a dipole and a loop that yields beautiful images in the abdomen. And we are going to, for example, to multiple loops at 7 Tesla. So all of these developments will come to 10.5 Tesla, and the image quality will definitely increase. And beyond just these developments that will follow in the footsteps of the 7 Tesla, there are unique coil developments. This is an effort by Yiğitcan Eryaman and Aliriza Sadaki Tarakame. And these are dipoles with a very interesting design. They are shortened dipoles using dielectric materials, high permittivity dielectric materials, a collaboration with Penn State, where they supply us with customized materials with a particular dielectric constant. So you can see this is underneath. There are non-uniform dielectric constant relative permittivity going from 100 to 1 and then to 20 to 100. These are optimized by simulations, and they have used this at the present time as a spine array, 3x3 spine array, as you can see over here. This coil is not approved yet by FDA, but they were able to get images on the spine in a cadaver, which are shown here. And this is a coronal slice, and there's an expanded version of the coronal slice showing very beautifully the structure within the spine and the gray-white matter contrast really nicely depicted at 10.5 Tesla. So head coils came later, and interestingly, of course, head is an easier target, but it turned out that a lot of the validation and safety studies in the head coils were much more problematic at 10.5 Tesla than the torso coils. That was the reason why the head effort was delayed. This is our very first approved head coil. It's actually a simple coil. It's just an 8-channel dipole. It has some unique design where the dipoles for SAR reduction they have a little bump here at where they are fed. But it's a very complicated workflow for modeling and then validation of that modeling. I don't have time to go through that, but we were able to achieve really excellent agreement between experiment and simulation. These are per channel B1 fields, experiment and simulation for first 4 channels, and then the next 4 channels. You can see that they are in excellent agreement. And looking at SAR, in this case, using probes to measure temperature, with fiber optic probes, and to calculate SAR. Blue and red are experiment and simulation data, so the simulation is in excellent agreement. And not only we do this for phantoms now centrally located like this, in this case centrally located in all axes, but you can shift that phantom and also compare if the simulation is still holding through. And here are some results for CP mode, linearly distributed phase, and everybody at the same phase. Here's experiment and simulation. You can see the results are in excellent agreement, where, in the shifted phantom, and these are just some random excitation patterns. They are not the ones that I mentioned. Here, 2 different random excitation patterns, but here's experiment, simulation, central, and shifted. So shifted, central, I just want to make the point that finally we have a situation where we can actually predict those very nicely. This is the first head image. I don't want you to think that this is the ultimate image. This is a coil that can be an example for just the transmitter for the ultimate coil. But nevertheless, we have a head image, and you can see that it is actually quite uniform. The ultimate coil is going to be separate transmitter and a separate receiver, and receivers will go up to 128 channels, but we start with a 32-channel receiver and a 16-channel transmitter. These are our colleagues who worked on, Nadir has built the receivers, and we have new preamplifiers and housing, implementation, and the whole engineering group is involved. It's really a big effort because there are some details. These are all built in University of Minnesota. And it's a big effort because of the fact that we want this receiver to have minimal interaction with the transmitter. And that's very important, not only because of the transmitter performance, but remember that we really have to, the power in this power deposition, in these multi-channel transmitters come from simulations, and the simulations have to be extremely accurate. And we want to see if we can avoid having to simulate the transmitter's performance without including the receiver. I mean, the alternative, and you include all the receiver and the electronics that go in there, is going to be quite complicated, doable. And so my colleagues paid a lot of attention to make sure that the interaction between the receiver and the transmitter is very small. And this is the demonstration of that. In fact, there's really minimal effect as you put in this receiver. So we are at the present time very close. In fact, after we go back, a lot of the safety data will be collected. But what I can show you already is that this is an SNR comparison, very preliminary, between this coil. Please ignore all of these things because we didn't use all the channels of the receiver, the transmitter, and so there are some excitation areas where the B1 is weak. But this is the Nova coil, which we all use and like very much at 7 Tesla. So it's comparing 7 Tesla Nova coil with this new coil at 10.5 Tesla in a human head-shaped phantom. And you can see that there are SNR gains, factor of 2 to 3 SNR gains, which are really exciting. I mean, that's the kind of SNR gain we need to reach our goals. And parallel imaging. Parallel imaging gets better when you go to high fields. And this is only a 32-channel coil right now. Here's a comparison with the 64-channel coil we built and published recently in 2019. This is 7 Tesla. And you can see that this coil with 32 channels at 10.5 Tesla does, in terms of G-factor noise, about as good as something like a 64-channel brain coil, not brain and neck, but brain coil, 64 channels at 7 Tesla. And if you compare it to 7 Tesla 32-channel Nova coil, the performance is, in terms of parallel imaging, significant. Now, when we look at we do quite a lot of simulations. This is supported by a very large grant from NIH, multi-institutional grant. And our colleagues, Ricardo Lotanzi at NYU, are supposed to, and they do, simulations to guide our engineering development. So these are some simulations at 10.5 Tesla, 64 and 128 channel simulations. In fact, looking at SNR of the array versus ultimate SNR, and you can see that as you go to higher number of channels, you really capture most of the ultimate SNR at 10.5 Tesla, but you need to go to these high channels. In the center, it turns out, you can capture most of the SNR even with a 32 channel. The SNR gains are really coming on the edges. These are harder to approach ultimate SNR, but the higher number of channels are needed. However, remember that we are interested in high-resolution imaging, so that means that we are going to be accelerating quite a bit to be able to achieve those images rapidly. And when you accelerate, you lose SNR, and even in the center, especially in the center. And these high channel counts are going to be very important when you go to accelerated imaging everywhere, including the center. And that is shown here. So dark colors are bad here. So this is 4x4 acceleration. You can see that that noise amplification is much better controlled at 128. So we are going to go step by step. We are starting to build the 64-channel version of this coil that you saw. And we will be submitting for FDA approval for the 32-channel, I hope, in the very near future. And then subsequently, it will be going to 128 channels. And we are also very much cognizant of the fact that in 10.5 Tesla, X nuclei become extremely important. There's quite a bit of effort there. It's part of some of our grants, and this is if again from a specimen because of the fact that every coil has to be approved by FDA, but showing sodium images, in the knee joint. And this is a coil, it's a 3 Tesla proton coil that we retune to sodium. And then we take these elements from our body coil, which is so modular for protons, and these are 2 of those sitting there to enable the proton images. And, okay, I don't necessarily have a very good sense of sodium imaging, but my colleagues who work on sodium imaging, they say this SNR that they get is really quite phenomenal, and they are really excited about looking into that, not only in the joint, but we have many different organs targeted for multinuclear imaging. So in summary, so even though imaging is right now a secondary objective of the ongoing safety protocol, we are in fact almost finished this first safety protocol. We have submitted and talked to FDA about reducing the time it takes to do all of the safety measurements so that we can actually have faster turnover. Right now, the subjects have to spend 4 days with us, very extensive testing of vestibular and cognitive function. So in the limited time available, it was demonstrated that imaging multiple targets at 10.5 Tesla feasible, using 10-channel dipole array in the torso and 8-channel dipole array in the head, and current RF management strategies. Improvements, of course, really big improvements are anticipated through continued RF coil development and further PTX implementation. I'd like to end with, of course, acknowledging a very large group of people in Center for Magnetic Resonance Research who have contributed to all of these development, going from engineering to pulse calculations to various methodological developments and sequence development, and in particular our engineering group currently led by Gregor Adriani, who is here, and many other people who contribute to many aspects of that. Here's Yiğitcan Eryaman, I mentioned him. Arjan Ertürk contributed immensely to the body coil development. Eddie to everything, and he's going to be very busy very soon working on the 128 channel development together with Siemens, Russell Lagore, a lot of the RF development, preamplifiers, etc. And Andrea Grant, who has been also instrumental in getting a lot of the work going. Xiaoping, whose name you heard a lot, is very active in the PTX pulse design. And with that, I'd like to end my talk, and thank you very much for your attention. And one advertisement, I should say, we are holding, as you know, every other year we hold a Minnesota workshop on high and ultra-high field imaging, and we have this workshop in November 12 to 16 this year, and I hope many of you will be able to make it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kamil. Do we have any questions from the audience? I mean, Kamil, can I maybe ask one while we're waiting? In terms of physiological tolerability, have you seen any differences at all between 7 Tesla and 10.5 Tesla so far?
You know, there are, these subjects are extensively monitored for a lot of testing, and there are some, and of course, before that, we did quite a lot of animal testing before we went to the FDA with pigs and mice. I mean, there are minor effects that seem to be showing up over 7 Tesla, but nothing terribly, nothing serious or even significant. So we presented some of those at ISMRM already, and I hope we'll be publishing them soon. But essentially, the answer is it looks pretty good.
Okay, great. Right, well, thank you very much.